something was wrong with the numbers. The disposal tank in Bright City's processing quarter held enough solvent to break down 300 liters of contaminated paint per cycle. It ran every night without exception and had done so for 11 years. Every morning the maintenance crew arrived, cleared the residue, and reset the intake valves. The schedule was so reliable that the lead technician had stopped cross-checking the printout against her own readings. On a particular morning, she checked the printout and found nothing to clear. Not a malfunction. Not a spill. The tank was completely empty, its inner walls cold in a way that made her pull her palm back and check her fingers twice after touching them. And slumped against the outer wall, breathing in slow, shallow pulls, were two B-rank pioneers who had been assigned to overnight supervision. Both men were albino, not pale, not ill. Albino in the total sense. Every shade drained from skin and hair, the deep amber of one and the saturated green of the other simply gone, as though something had reached into them and drawn it all out the way you drain a basin. Complete, methodical. A senior investigator arrived the following morning and read the report with the careful attention of someone trained to notice what does not belong. She visited the site, she circled the tank 3 times, crouched over the drainage crack in the floor, and found a stain dried into the seam. Dark. Far darker than anything the solvent produced in the normal course of a cycle. She held her lantern low over it and stayed crouched for a long moment. Then she stood up and filed her report and left the stain out of it. At the bottom of the page, underlined once, she wrote the only question that mattered. Who authorized use of this tank last night? The guard records gave her an answer the following afternoon. 2 men had signed in after midnight with a standard transport authorization. The cargo listed was a colorless individual, collected for routine processing. Disposal. The colorless individual was not in the tank. In Bright City, that was the detail that refused to fit. Colorless people did not survive disposal. Colorless people did not, by the logic the city ran on, do much of anything beyond filling the bottom tier of every system that needed labor without recognition. They had no color, and in a world where color determined rank, power, and the basic measure of a person's worth, having none meant no means to resist, no standing to object, no real significance if they vanished. That was the foundation of the city's order. It was not disputed. It was simply how things were. But the tank was empty. 2 trained B-rank pioneers were drained to nothing, and something had left a black stain at the drain. To understand what happened in that tank, you have to go back 3 days. Kay had been in the cave since before sunrise. The chromite vein in the north-facing tunnel was not a good source. What it was available, no permit required, no color certification demanded at the checkpoint. Pioneer permits opened access to the richer seams, and he held none. He had a used pickaxe with a replaced handle, a carry bag splitting along the left seam, and Nero. And he worked with those until the bag was heavy enough to justify the surface trip. Nero occupied a flat rock near the tunnel mouth, small, roughly cat-sized, built close to the ground, with wide, dark eyes that caught the lantern light and returned it in 2 steady points. Nero had a quality Kay had spent years trying to name before eventually giving up on the project. Not patience exactly. Something more like presence. The quality of a creature that has decided to be here, fully and permanently, and has no need to demonstrate this with movement or sound. Nero had been with Kay for longer than his earliest clear memory. He did not know where Nero had come from. He had run out of productive ways to wonder about it years ago and settled instead for the simpler fact Nero was always there. In the years that had included the things he preferred not to revisit, that constancy had been worth more than he usually let himself acknowledge. He swung the pickaxe. He thought about the entrance exam notice pinned to the lower left corner of the Pioneer Corporation board. He had read it 11 times over the past 2 weeks. He had wanted to be a pioneer for longer than he could precisely locate the beginning of the wanting. Not for the rank alone, though rank would have been useful. What he wanted was what pioneers actually were. People who went past the walls, moved through the territory no one else could navigate, and came back with what the city needed. People the city acknowledged. The city had been telling him since he was old enough to understand the word colorless that this would not be available to him. He had been, quietly and with increasing stubbornness, disagreeing. Nero nudged the carry bag with 1 foot. Kay knotted it shut and went up. The lower district market was already running when he arrived. He sold the ore at the rate he expected, low, bought food for the week, and moved through the rest of the stalls with his eyes down. He had learned early that making eye contact in public, when you were albino, was an invitation, not a welcome kind. He had one errand left. The Pioneers Corporation building sat at the junction of the lower and middle districts. 3 stories painted in layered bands of saturated color so concentrated the edges almost vibrated. The paint choices were not incidental. The building communicated to everyone passing from the lower district exactly what having color meant and who possessed it. Kay had stood in front of it many times. He had walked away every time. Today he walked in. He had spent 3 nights on the paint sample. Chromite ore ground fine, blended with binding agents from Mary's supply shelf, worked into a concentrated color suspension that demonstrated actual manipulation ability at a standard most certified applicants would struggle to exceed. It was not a formal credential, it was evidence. He believed that evidence, presented to someone who was actually paying attention, would earn at minimum a conversation. He set the vial on the intake counter. The man behind the counter looked at the vial, then at Kay. Then he called 2 colleagues over in the tone of someone who has spotted something that deserves an audience. The conversation that followed was brief. The man told Kay the corporation did not process colorless applicants under any current provision. He said the sample was not a qualifying document regardless of its content. He said this in the voice of a procedure, something recited enough times to have lost whatever weight it might once have carried. One of the colleagues made a short sound. The other watched with flat attention, waiting for the moment this resolved into whatever came next. Kay picked up the vial. The hand that struck him across the shoulders came from behind, hard enough to drive him into the doorframe. The vial hit the stone floor and did not survive. The chromite suspension spread across the flagstones in a thin, pale streak. 3 nights of careful work bleeding out into the entry hall of a building that had never intended to let him in. Someone said something about contamination of the entry hall. He walked out. He stood in the street while people moved past him in both directions without a glance. He looked at the stain on his jacket sleeve, the quiet mirror of the one on their floor, and felt the specific kind of anger that gets refined through enough identical mornings until it becomes something quieter than anger. Closer to decision. There is something the city had never bothered to examine in its own terminology for the colorless. White was not the absence of color. Basic optics said the opposite. White was every color simultaneously, every wavelength present and reflected at once. The surface that appeared most empty was the surface that contained the most. Nobody in Bright City had ever applied this to people. But it was true, and it was going to matter. Mary's workshop sat between a paint supply house and a flatbread stall, 3 streets north of the main market. The flatbread smell reached you half a block away in the morning, and it was the most reliable comfort the lower district offered by a wide margin. Mary ran the shop alone. Spoit repairs, custom ink work, tool maintenance, special orders she found room for between the rest. She was albino. Her fingertips were always slightly color-stained despite working without any pigment of her own, from the contact with the dyes she handled, and she had explained once that contact was different from absorption, and that had been the end of that particular discussion. She had known Kay since before the shop had existed, since the years neither of them talked about much anymore. The friendship had formed the way some do when the circumstances narrow the choices, but the choices that remain turn out to be exactly right. She had told him he could be a pioneer before he fully believed it himself. She had said it the way she said most things that mattered, directly, without decoration, and he had carried it forward the way you carry something too important to set down. She was under the work table when he came through the door, flat on her back with a wrench working a seized bolt on a damaged spoit intake mechanism. She did not stop until the bolt turned. Then she slid out, sat up, and looked at him. The torn shoulder and the dried stain on his sleeve told her what she needed to know. She asked nothing. She wiped the wrench on the cloth folded over her apron strap and told him about the Aurora Pioneers high-grade exam. The high-grade exam ran different criteria from the standard corporation intake. No color certificate, no referral, no registered spoit on file. The criterion was demonstrated field ability, tested in live conditions. She had heard the examination panel this cycle included the S rank called Red, a name that moved through the lower district the way genuinely significant names do, without announcement but with weight. Red evaluated what candidates could actually do, rather than what their paperwork said about them. Kay told her he had no spoit, no entry equipment, nothing he could put together before registration closed at the end of the week. Mary set the wrench on the work table. She went to the back shelf and came back with a carry case he had not seen before. Inside, clean clothes, properly pressed. A field supply kit with treatment vials and bandages. A spoit she had clearly refurbished herself. The outer casing worn but the intake mechanism rebuilt from new fittings, and the color channel cleaned to precise specification. At the bottom, wrapped separately, a quantity of mid-grade personal ink. She told him she had been putting it together for 2 months. He looked at the case, then at her. She told him not to make anything out of it and reached for the wrench. Nero climbed out of his bag and crossed the work table and sat directly in front of her face. She reached over without breaking her focus on the spoit and scratched behind Nero's ears, and Nero's eyes dropped to half-mast, and Nero made the particular low sound that meant complete approval of everything currently happening. The tension Kay carried in his shoulders when he came through the door had eased without him noticing it leave. He took the case. He thanked her in a way he knew was nowhere near proportionate. She waved it off and went back under the table. He left the following morning, carrying the pack and Nero and the specific feeling of someone who has run on nothing long enough that a genuine chance feels risky to believe in. He did not reach the examination office. 2 blocks before the district boundary, 3 men stepped out of the alley junction ahead of him. Dock workers by their clothing, which in this part of the city was a particular kind of signal. 2 of them moved to his sides with the economy of people who had performed this exact task before. The grip on his arms came before he could adjust. The 3rd man reached into his carry bag and pulled Nero out, and transferred Nero into a wooden box and latched it closed before Kay had fully processed what was happening. Nero did not stop. He could hear it. Claws against wood, systematic and furious. Nero working at the inside of that box without pause. Kay pulled against the arms holding him. He got a strike across the backs of his knees that dropped him to the ground. One of the men crouched to his level. Dark eyes, an unremarkable face, and the voice of someone who had delivered this particular explanation enough times to have removed every unnecessary word from it. He said that colorless people who tried to register for the Pioneer exam had a reliable habit of ending up in the processing quarter, and that certain individuals were compensated to maintain the reliability of that habit by parties with an interest in the exam producing consistent outcomes. He laid this out with no particular heat, the way a person explains a sensible system to someone who simply has not been informed of it yet. Kay's eyes went to the wooden box. The sounds inside it had not stopped. The 3rd man checked the authorization paper in his pocket and said the tank was prepped and ready. They carried Kay to the processing quarter. They threw him in. The solvent was total. He went under before he had his arms up and came up into the smell of it. Industrial. Absolute. And his skin was already registering it as more than pain, not burning at the surface. The solvent found the gaps between things and worked from every direction simultaneously, and his hands were shaking and his vision had gone wrong and he went under again. He came up and stayed up. The inks dissolved in the solution surrounded him, accumulated from weeks of previous processing cycles, and he understood in a general way, moving through them, that he was dissolving. Then something in his chest went quiet. The quiet of a room when everyone in it stops talking at the same moment. The pressure that followed was not pain. It was weight, enormous and patient and old, pressing outward from a point deep in the center of him. And with it came something that occupied the space a voice would occupy, forming somewhere below his ribs. Not sound, the idea of a voice. Stop fighting the color around you. He could not have said why he listened. The solvent had taken up most of the capacity he used for rational choices. What remained made one decision, and the decision was to stop. The color moved. Toward him, all of it. The dissolved pigments. The residue of weeks of cycles. The color saturated into the tank walls at a level that should have required industrial equipment to extract. It oriented toward his skin and moved with direction and speed, the way liquid crosses a surface toward an open drain. Where it touched him, it went in. The white of his hair darkened from the roots outward. His hands went black, then deeper. Something enormous expanded from his chest, and the stream became a flood, and the level in the tank dropped and kept dropping, and somewhere between the first pull and the last, he stopped tracking individual sensations and was aware only of intake. Vast, total, complete. He was standing at the bottom of a dry tank. His hands were black, not coated, not stained. The color had settled into him permanently, the way dye takes into cloth when the conditions are exactly right. His hair was the same. The reflection in the metal floor showed him a face he recognized only by its shape. He felt saturated, full in a way he had no previous word for. Through the tank wall he could sense the two men outside, their color, amber and green, present and accessible. He placed his palm flat against the metal. The color came through before he had finished deciding to take it. The two men outside went still, and then went down. He put his shoulder to the wall and it bent and then gave, and he stepped out into the cold air of the processing quarter and kept walking. The dark presence in his chest had no interest in stopping. He came back to himself in the Blacklands. No memory of the crossing. He was simply on his back in dark soil, a pale diffused sky above him, and the smell of raw ambient ink in every breath. He had no pioneer rank, no authorization, no gear beyond what Mary had packed and apparently left behind somewhere in the events of the previous several hours. He was in the territory that began where Bright City's walls ended and did not get easier from there. He sat up. His hands were still black. He flexed his fingers, slow and deliberate. Nero appeared from behind a root cluster and walked to him across the dark ground and up his arm to his shoulder and sat. Kay let out a slow breath. The familiar weight of it settled something in him. He was alive. Given the tank, that was not an unremarkable outcome. A creature stepped out from between two ink-black trees 40 meters ahead, moving without hurry. Large through the chest and shoulders, with a single pale eye and a wide flat skull, 3 sets of curved forelegs gripping the uneven ground with long practice. The membrane along its back rippled with absorbed ambient ink. It had the gait of something that had not expected competition for a long time. He had no spoit. No ink of his own, no rank, no training in the formal sense. He had black hands and Nero on his shoulder and whatever was sitting in his chest. The creature charged. He moved sideways and the shoulder of it caught him anyway and threw him 3 meters. He rolled, came up with dark soil in his mouth, cleared the second pass by less than comfort allowed. The third attack caught his forearm, claws tore through, and his blood fell white against the black ground. Still white. The change had not reached that far. The creature's claw was wet with the ambient ink of the Blacklands. Where that ink touched the cut, he felt it pull inward, absorb. He grabbed the foreleg with both hands and held on. The ink came out of the creature in a single wave, too fast to be precise, and hit his chest raw and cold and enormous. The creature seized and went over sideways into the soil, alive but emptied, all the power that had driven that charge simply gone. Kay let go and sat down in the dirt. He turned his forearm over. The skin was unbroken where the claw had torn through it. He held it there for a moment. Then he pressed his other palm flat against the soil. The ambient ink in the Blacklands was everywhere. Ground, root systems, air. He felt it come toward him slowly, filling him in small increments, the way you top off a vessel after it has been poured out. Not fast, but real. He could draw from the territory itself. There were more sounds from the trees before long. More creatures, attracted by whatever signal the first one had sent out or stopped sending. He dealt with them one by one, not cleanly and not efficiently, but effectively. By the third he understood the broad principle. The cost of using his power was high, burning through what he had absorbed faster than he expected, but the sources available to him in the Blacklands were extensive. Creatures, soil, the air at low concentration. He could not afford to spend recklessly, but he would not run dry as long as the territory gave him something to drain. When the sounds from the trees fell away and the dark settled back into ordinary quiet, he sat for a moment and let his breathing slow. He thought about the examination office. Registration ended at the end of the week. He had been thrown into a disposal tank, absorbed everything in it, walked through the Blacklands without a rank or a permit, and fought several creatures that should have left him as dark soil. He was sitting in pioneer territory with black hair and no authorization, and the only thing that had substantively changed about his plan was that the men who had tried to stop him were now albino. He got to his feet. He looked in the direction of the city. Then he started walking. The city gates were not heavily supervised in the early morning, when the ore carts came in from the outer mines, and the light was still too flat for color differentials to read quickly at distance. Kay had learned this over years of early runs. He knew which post was understaffed between 6th and 7th bell, and which lane the cart traffic used that kept a patrol's sightlines occupied. He walked in close to the side of a wagon loaded with black chromite ore, which meant the black of his hair and hands were not the most conspicuous thing in the immediate area. He moved through the checkpoint without anyone stopping him. He was in the city with black hair and black hands and no plan beyond the next 2 hours, but he was in. Mary's workshop light was already on when he arrived. She was at the bench, not under the table this time, standing with a small pestle working something in a grinding bowl. She looked up when the door opened and her hand stopped. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He was, by any reasonable measure, a different person to look at than the one who had left her workshop the previous morning. The hair alone was a substantial change. The hands were more dramatic. Whatever the tank had done to him had done it completely and visibly. And in the early morning light coming through the workshop window, there was nothing ambiguous about what she was seeing. She set the pestle down. She asked him, in a voice she kept carefully level, whether he was injured. He told her he was not. He told her what had happened in short form. The 3 men, the tank, the Blacklands, the creatures, the walk back. And she listened without interrupting, which was something she was capable of when the information warranted it. When he finished, she stood with her palms flat on the work table and looked at a point somewhere between them and said nothing for a few seconds. Then she went to the storage cabinet and came back with a tin of masking preparation. A surface coat she made herself for color-sensitive restoration work, not a dye, but a treatment that would read as standard dark coloring at a casual glance, enough to get him through registration without triggering the response that actual black would trigger the moment anyone saw it clearly. She told him it was temporary, a few hours at a time, maximum. He would need to reapply before the exam. He told her he understood. She began the application in silence. Nero had climbed out of the carry case and was sitting at the far end of the work table watching, which Nero did with the same settled quality as always, as though watching Kay be coated in masking treatment was a routine part of a normal morning. After a moment, Nero made a quiet sound. Mary glanced at Nero and continued working, and the expression on her face had the quality of someone filing a considerable amount of information away for a conversation they intended to have once the immediate problem was handled. The examination hall for the Aurora Pioneers high-grade entry was large, with 3 concurrent match floors and tiered viewing stands along the outer wall where Pioneer Corp members sat to evaluate incoming talent. The space smelled of color ink and spoit residue, the metallic trace of 100 practice activations baked into the floor over many exam cycles. Kay arrived at registration with his carry case and no spoit in hand. The registration clerk looked at his form and asked where his weapon was. He told her he had not brought one. She made a note and gave him his match number. He was placed in the first bracket. His first opponent was already on the floor when Kay arrived. Tall, green coloring, a sword at his hip, and the specific kind of ease that comes from being told you are the person to watch often enough to believe it completely. Gale. The name had moved through the exam waiting area the way the name of an expected winner moves, easily, without challenge. The other candidates made space around him without seeming to notice they were doing it. Gale looked at Kay when Kay stepped onto the floor. His eyes moved to the carry case, then to the absence of any weapon, then to Kay's posture. He said something to the candidate nearest him, too low to carry. The candidate laughed. The official called the start. Kay crossed the distance in under 2 seconds. He hit Gale once, open palm at center mass, and Gale went into the wall behind him, hard enough that the viewing stands went quiet before the sound finished echoing. 5 seconds. Possibly less. Gale slid down the wall and sat on the floor. He looked at the space where Kay had been standing. He looked at Kay. Then he looked at his sword, still sheathed at his hip, and opened his mouth and could not find anything to put in it. The official announced the match result. The stands produce the sound a crowd makes when it has witnessed something it does not have a category for, not applause, not silence, something suspended between the two. Subsequent matches followed the same general shape without repeating the same specific moment. By the third fight, the viewing stands had developed a theory. Kay was a close-range specialist with a weakness at distance. By the 5th fight, that theory had been dismantled, because the candidate who had exploited the supposed distance weakness was now sitting on the floor next to his spoit, which Kay had taken apart with his bare hands during the approach. The revised theory was that Kay was strange in ways that the available vocabulary did not adequately cover. What the stands had no theory for was the color. The masking treatment in his hair had started to thin by the third match. Temporary surface coatings were not built for sustained physical exertion, and 3 bouts of close-contact fighting had worn it down to inconsistency. By the 5th match, the treatment on his hands had gone entirely. What showed underneath was not the deep tone of a heavily pigmented practitioner. It was black, pure and undiluted, the color that in Bright City's entire recorded history had belonged to exactly one category of thing: the creatures of the Blacklands. The things outside the walls, the darkness that had nearly ended human civilization once, and that the pioneers existed to hold back. A murmur started in the viewing stands and built without reaching any conclusion. Black was not a color a human being carried. No exam, no record, no pioneering account had ever documented it on a human colorist. The crowd looked at Kay's hands and had no comfortable place to put what they were seeing, and discomfort in crowds tends to produce noise rather than questions. Kay was aware of all of it. He finished his matches and did not address it. In the stands, a red-haired man sat with his arms crossed and an expression of specific, focused attention that was different in quality from the attention of the people around him. He had been there since the Gale match. He had not moved. Midway through the afternoon session, the regular examination panel stepped back. The red-haired man came down from the stands. He introduced himself to the remaining candidates in roughly 8 words, without spending time on credentials, because his credentials arrived in rooms before he did. Red, S-rank, chroma fire ability that had been in the Pioneer record books for over a decade. He said he was taking over the evaluation format for the final stage. The format he described was environmental endurance. The floor was going to become hostile. Pressure, heat, color interference at shifting frequencies. Every candidate would maintain a personal barrier using their own color output for as long as they could hold it. Duration and output quality were the metrics. He set the conditions and stepped back. The floor changed. Kay held his barrier and did not let himself think about what was underneath it. For the first 2 minutes, it was manageable. The absorbed energy from the Blacklands creatures gave him a reservoir that standard candidates did not have, and barrier maintenance was a different demand from the offensive expenditure of the earlier matches. He focused on keeping the output even and contained. By the 4th minute, the barrier was costing him more than he had calculated. Creature-absorbed energy was not the same quality as refined personal ink. It degraded faster under sustained output, and the black in his hair, already visible through the worn masking, was shifting in texture, not fading, thinning, getting closer to white at the roots. He was going to go albino in front of the entire examination hall if he did not stop spending. He reduced the output. The barrier thinned but held. Around him, the other candidates were beginning to fail, their barriers breaking one by one under the escalating environmental pressure, and each collapse released a burst of color energy back into the space. That energy moved toward him. Everything moved toward him. He was not asking it to, and he could not entirely stop it, and the pull built as more barriers broke and more color became available. He clamped down on it with the discipline he had developed over hours in the Blacklands. He was a container, not a drain. He chose what entered. He was in control of this. But the environment was saturating with released color, and his absorption pull was open, and the scale of it was too large for precision, like trying to redirect a river with cupped hands. The nearest remaining barrier touched his pull and connected. He felt it the moment it happened and tried to retract it. The retraction sent the pull sideways into the barrier on his other side. He pulled that back. The connection distributed itself across every functioning barrier left on the floor in the 3 seconds he spent fighting it, and in those 3 seconds, all 8 remaining barriers fed into him in sequence, one after the other, and the endurance test collapsed entirely. The floor went very quiet. 8 candidates stood without barriers. The color they had been holding was now, imprecisely but completely, inside K. His hair was fully black. His hands were darker than they had been that morning. He was standing in an examination hall where he had just involuntarily drained every other candidate, and the evaluation panel's scoring sheet did not have a provision for this. Red stood at the far end of the floor with his arms uncrossed. He looked at Kay for a long moment. Then he told the other candidates the session was concluded, and their scores from the individual rounds would be processed normally. He told them they were dismissed. He waited until the hall was empty. Then he told Kay to stay. Red sat on the edge of the floor, and looked at K the way someone looks at a problem they find genuinely interesting. He said he knew about the disposal tank. K said nothing. Red said the investigation was ongoing, that 2 veterans were albino, and that the transport authorization with K's name had been routed to Red specifically as the S rank, with jurisdiction over the lower district pioneer activity. He said he had read it and come to today's exam because the registration list included a colorless individual, and he had wanted to see what a colorless individual did when placed in a room with real competition. He said he had seen enough. Then he held out his arm and told K to try. K asked what that meant. Red said he meant the absorption. He said he wanted to understand the limit of it. He said it in the tone of someone who has already finished the risk assessment and decided to proceed regardless, and K recognized that tone and understood that declining was also a kind of answer. He reached out and placed his hand on Red's forearm. The color inside Red was unlike anything he had encountered. S rank did not describe it. It was depth of saturation that the creatures of the Blacklands could not approach. A quality of refinement so dense that his absorption pull opened in response to it, the way a door opens when you remove the weight holding it shut. It kept opening. The more concentrated the source, the harder the pull was to control, and Red was the most concentrated source he had ever touched, and the pull did not want to stop at a sample. He pulled his hand back after 3 seconds. His hands were darker. The pressure in his chest was larger than it had been when he woke in the Blacklands. Red's forearm showed a visible drop in saturation at the point of contact. Red was quiet for a moment. He looked at his arm. Then he said that was enough. He said K had 2 choices. The first was that the disposal tank incident remained on record. The investigation ran its course, and K's involvement in permanently draining 2 B-rank pioneers became a formal charge, at which point the outcome was straightforward and final. The second was that Red closed the file under his jurisdiction, and in exchange, K joined Red's roster as a student and operated under Red's direct supervision. He said it was not a threat. He said it was an arrangement that happened to benefit both parties and that K should not mistake the framing for pressure, because Red had no particular need to pressure a candidate who had absorbed an entire endurance test by accident. K looked at the empty floor. He thought about the vial. He thought about 3 nights of careful work spreading across the entry hall flagstones. He thought about the men who had made a routine out of doing what they had done to him, and about those same men being white as paper on the other side of the tank wall. He told Red he would take the second choice. Red nodded. He picked up his jacket and said they would begin in 3 days, and that K should rest, because what came after rest was not going to leave much room for it. He said one more thing at the door. He said that whatever was inside K that had reached for all of Red's color in 3 seconds needed to learn to ask before it reached, because the day it reached somewhere it could not stop pulling from was going to be difficult for everyone in the vicinity. He left. K stood alone in the hall with Nero on his shoulder and darker hands than he had walked in with, and the quiet that settles over a day that has contained several things you did not expect at the start of it. The exam results posted the following morning. K's score placed him in the provisional register pending team assignment. Gale's score, despite the first match, was high enough to qualify on the remaining rounds, which meant that when Red's roster was announced 2 days later, Gale's name was on it directly above K's. Gale looked at the posting and looked at K's name and said nothing, which was a more complicated silence than the one after the wall. A young woman named Ellie had submitted herself for Red's team without being asked. Cyan coloring, a sword, and the quality of movement that reads as genuine training in about 3 seconds of observation. When K checked the roster, she was already looking at him, and when he noticed, she did not look away. 3 days later, Red stood in front of his team and told them they were going into the Blacklands, not on an official expedition, not with full authorization from the Pioneer Corps hierarchy. Red said this without apology, in the way he seemed to say most things, and he said their destination was a specific location in the outer Blacklands that had been producing anomalous readings on the Scouts' color instruments for 3 weeks. He said the 3 rookies were coming because this was what training looked like on his team, and that if anyone wanted to object, they had until tomorrow morning. No one objected. They left at dawn, 4 people and Nero, through the gate that Red had access to under his S-rank clearance, and by the time the city was half an hour behind them, the color of the world had already changed. The Blacklands were not dark in the dramatic sense. They were saturated, everything in them carrying a depth of raw ink that the city's processed and refined color did not match. The air itself had a quality. The ground was different to walk on. Even Nero, who Kay had never seen hesitate, moved with slightly more deliberate steps. Red walked ahead of them without checking whether they were keeping up. 30 minutes into the territory, the scout readings led them to it, a sphere of absolute darkness, roughly 2 meters in diameter, hovering above the ground between two dead ink trees. Not a shadow, not a darkness caused by blocked light, a sphere of something else entirely, a material darkness that absorbed the light around it and gave nothing back. Red stopped in front of it. He told Kay to put his hand on it. Kay looked at the sphere. He looked at Red. Red said it was a barrier, a sealed one. He said no pioneer he knew of had been able to open it, and that included the current Luminous, which was the title of the woman who sat at the absolute peak of Bright City's power. He said that if Kay's absorption could open what nothing else could, they needed to know that today, in controlled conditions, before something else brought it to their attention. Kay stepped forward and placed his hand against the surface of the sphere. The absorption started immediately. The sphere was not empty inside. It was packed, dense with ink and sealed force, and as it drained into him, the pressure in his chest expanded to accommodate the incoming volume, and the black of his hair deepened by a shade he could feel rather than see. The sphere shrank. In 40 seconds it was gone. What it had been containing was released into the air around them. Creatures, a great many of them, previously compressed and sealed inside the barrier, now aware of the open territory and moving. Red said, "Engage." The creatures came out of the sphere in all directions at once. Not a trickle, a release, the way pressure finds the first available exit and does not slow down on the way through. They were varied in size and type, things that had been compressed inside the barrier long enough that the open air seemed to disorient them before the instinct to orient toward color took over. Bright human color was the most concentrated source in the Blacklands. 4 humans and Nero were the most concentrated things for several miles. Red said one word, "Engage." Gale drew his sword before the word had fully landed. Green energy channeled down the blade as he moved into the left cluster. Fast, precise, with the technical cleanliness of someone whose training had not been wasted, despite the impression Kay had left on him at the exam. Ellie took the right flank, ice forming along her weapon's edge and spreading across the outer ground in sheets that slowed the far ring of creatures before they reached striking distance. Kay took the middle. The barrier sphere had refilled him substantially when it drained, and he used that reserve now. 3 contacts in the first pass, absorbing fast and converting immediately, spending the incoming energy on the next engagement rather than holding it. The creatures here were smaller and faster than what he had faced alone in the Blacklands, which meant each fight was shorter but cost more per second of contact. By the 8th creature, the reserve was noticeably lower. He rationed the remaining absorption carefully and finished what needed finishing with momentum and positioning rather than power. 8 minutes. When the last creature dropped, the ground around the sphere site was covered in very drained wildlife, and 3 rookies breathing harder than they would have preferred anyone to notice. Kay had used more than half of what the sphere had given him. Red had stood 30 meters back and watched the entire engagement. When the last creature went still, he was writing something on the inside of his wrist with a small color pen. The way he took notes he did not want on paper. He capped the pen and said they had done well. It was not warm praise. It was more than nothing. The sword demon arrived 40 minutes into the expedition. No announcement. The background texture of the Blacklands, the constant low register of ambient creature sounds and ink-saturated wind, went briefly flat, and in that flatness something dropped from the ink-black canopy above them and landed between the team and the route back to the city. It stood upright. That was the first disorienting thing. The torso and skull were human in their proportions. The left arm was human, dark-skinned, long, still at its side. The right arm was a creature's limb from the shoulder down, massive, triple-jointed, covered in black membrane, ending in a hand with too many fingers, each tipped in something that was not bone and did not reflect light. Its eyes moved across the group. They stopped on Kay. Red stepped forward. His voice had changed, not louder, but carrying a quality underneath it that had not been audible before, like a building's load-bearing structure becoming relevant when weight is applied. He told the 3 rookies to go back. He used the word tactical. Gale started to object, and Red said it again, the same words, the same tone, and that was the end of the objection. The sword demon had not moved its eyes from Kay. It spoke, not to Red, not to Ellie, not to the group collectively, directly at Kay. Its voice had the wrong resonance for a human throat, too layered, as though several registers were running at once. It used a single word, key. Then Red moved, and what followed was not something a viewer at Kay's distance could track cleanly. S-rank chroma fire at full deployment looked different from the accounts. Red's arm ignited from the elbow down, the color going past Red into a density that should not have been possible at that saturation level, and he covered the distance to the sword demon in under a second, and the exchange became a blur of force and color, and the controlled violence of someone who had been doing this long enough to make it look like economy. He turned his head just enough to be heard and said, "Go." He did not say it again. The ground beneath the ruins site was not solid. Kay was 3 steps toward the tree line when Gale grabbed his arm and pointed at the earth ahead of them. A crack, wide and running, cutting across the ground at the base of the nearest dead ink tree. Old damage. The absorption of the sphere had been the last anchor point for an underground structure that had been failing for some time before they arrived. Without it, the structural logic of whatever was below them had given up. The ground opened. He fell a significant distance in complete dark and hit loose soil at the bottom and lay still for a moment, running an inventory of what had broken and finding, with some surprise, nothing. He heard Gale land to his left, Ellie a moment after. Then Nero landed on his chest with the composure of a creature that had assessed this development and found it within acceptable parameters. Above them, the crack in the earth had already narrowed as the soil shifted. The sounds of Red's fight filtered through for a few seconds longer. Then the gap sealed, and the sounds were gone, and they were in total dark. Nero's eyes lit. Not a metaphor, the eyes themselves, producing a thin, warm light that was directional and steady and sufficient to navigate by. Kay had never in his life questioned this capacity. He had simply been grateful for it too many times to spend effort on wondering. He looked around. Architecture. Walls with carved recesses at regular intervals. A floor that had been smooth stone before centuries of ink saturation had warped it out of flatness. The passages were tall in a scale that had not been built for human proportions. The air was denser here than the surface blacklands. Older ink, undisturbed for a very long time. Breathing required slightly more attention. Nero moved forward and looked back. They followed Nero for 20 minutes through the underground passages. 20 minutes to try not to think about Red on the surface, about what the sword demon had called Kay, about the word key, spoken in a voice that was not built for the word it was using, aimed at Kay specifically, with the certainty of something that knew exactly what it had found. The Guardian was waiting at the junction of 2 major corridors, not alive, constructed, built into the architecture the way a lock is built into a door, present at this specific location for the specific function of preventing passage. Large, angular, with limbs that moved with the sound of stone on stone. Its sensor apertures swept across Gale, registered him, moved on. Swept across Ellie, registered her, moved on. Reached Kay and stopped. The color code it had been calibrated to identify was black. It moved toward him before he had processed the conclusion, ignoring the other 2 as irrelevant to its function, and the first strike it directed at him was fast enough that he moved 3 feet to the right and it still caught his shoulder, and the force of it sent him backward into the passage wall, hard enough to leave a mark in the stone. Ellie moved, ice forming along the Guardian's nearest joint in the 3 seconds Kay needed to clear the angle. Gale came in on the mechanism's other side, probing for the failure point. They were wrong about the first 3 options. Midsection, upper joint, the aperture cluster, and Kay was struck twice more, and Gale went into a carved recess with enough force to crack the back of it, and Ellie lost the upper edge of her weapon to a deflection she had not fully calculated. What they established through all of that? The power source was an ink reservoir at the base of the Guardian's structure. Without it, the mechanism had no energy to run. Kay put both palms flat on the floor beneath it, and absorbed through the stone. The core drained upward through the Guardian's structure slowly at first, then all at once, the way heat transfers through metal when the differential is large enough. The Guardian's movement stuttered, slowed, stopped mid-extension, frozen in the position of its last incomplete action. They went around it. Nero stopped at a door at the far end of the main passage, sealed. The same dense black material as the sphere above ground. The same cold. The same quality of something being held inside. Kay put his hand on it, and it opened immediately. The way the sphere had opened. The way he was starting to understand certain things opened for him, and nothing else. What was beyond it was not the next passage. An expanse with no visible floor. Black and white, color entirely absent. A space that processed differently depending on where his eyes focused. Simultaneously close and vast. He stepped through. Gale and Ellie followed. The color left them the moment they were through. It was visible, the green draining from Gale's hair in a wave from crown to end, the cyan leaving Ellie in the same downward motion, both of them going flat white in under 4 seconds. With the color went their balance, and their spatial orientation, and their ability to stand without assistance. Both dropped to their knees, not unconscious, present, but untethered. Their ability gone, their internal compass pulled out by the roots. The void stripped color. Kay was unaffected. The space was black and white, and he had been rearranged too fundamentally for it to find purchase. The figure that appeared was not the sword demon and was not a creature in any category he had encountered. A shape built from the void itself, dark and light in ratios that kept shifting, moving toward him without contact with any surface. It stopped at arm's length and was still. And then the visions came without warning and without consent. A city destroyed. Older than Bright City, the architecture different, the color in the buildings a different quality. Above the destruction, a figure moved through the sky, too large, too dark, luminous at the edges, in a way that made direct focus impossible. He saw a portal opening above ruins that matched, in their specifics, the ruins he was standing in. He saw himself, not himself exactly, a shape that carried his structure, but glowed with something that was neither black nor white, but the thing that comes after both, standing in front of a door, vastly larger than any door in the underground passage, a door that had not been opened. He heard a name spoken directly into the part of him that processed voices, Lumiel. Then the figure was gone, and the visions were gone, and he was in a black and white void with 2 incapacitated teammates, and whatever the name Lumiel meant sitting in his chest, alongside everything else that had been accumulating there since the tank. Nero went to Gale first, crossed the void to him and placed both front paws on his chest and was still, and something moved in the air around them. A dispersal, a clearing, the specific quality of air in a closed room when you open a window that has been shut a long time. Gale's eyes refocused. He looked at his own white hands and the expression on his face was not reassured, but he was present and he was functional. Nero moved to Ellie and did the same. She looked up at Kay when her eyes came back and asked where they were. Her voice had the careful quality of someone holding a great deal of composure together by concentration. He told her they were almost through. It was the most honest thing he could offer. The Stella fragment was in the deepest chamber, a sealed alcove at the center of a floor that generated faint light from inside the stone. Pale, barely there, but visible after the dark of the passage like a candle is visible in a room that has had no windows. The fragment was smaller than he had imagined, a shard of something dense and pale, with an energy around it that made the air 2 degrees warmer than the rest of the chamber. He touched it. The absorption was different from everything else he had absorbed. The fragment did not resist and did not yield. It did something between the two, as though it recognized the contact and chose to respond rather than being drained. Colors moved through him in rapid sequence, each distinct and complete in the second it occupied him, too fast to name individually, not painful. Something that existed in its own category outside of comfortable and uncomfortable. When it was over, the fragment was still there. Nero stepped forward and ate it. There was no other word for the action. Nero opened his mouth, wider than the proportion of his face should have permitted, took the fragment in, and closed his mouth, and the fragment was gone. The faint glow it had been producing was still visible, just below Nero's skin, warm and contained. Gale looked at Nero. Kay told him it was fine. The ceiling of the chamber began to disagree with the structural premise it had been built on. The route out was not the route they had come through. The absorption of the barrier door had removed the last element, stabilizing an underground structure that had been failing long before they arrived. Passages were narrowing as the soil above shifted weight. The floor moved. They moved with it, Nero marking the route ahead, Kay pulling Gale from a collapsing section by the arm, Ellie redirecting a falling section of carved stone with the partial recovery of her ability. Not full power, but enough for the angle that mattered. They came out through a break in the surface 30 meters from where they had fallen. The Blacklands were quiet. Wrong quiet. The ambient sound that the territory always carried. Creature movement, ink wind through the tree canopy, the low background register of a living wilderness, was absent. Kay looked at the tree line and found nothing moving, and the nothing moving had the quality of a held breath. The sword demon came from above. It dropped between them and the city route, and the impact of its landing sent a shockwave through the soil. One motion. The creature arm swung across and closed around Gale's sword and crushed it. The sound that made was the sound of something ending. The second motion, the same arm reaching for Ellie. She was not fast enough to clear it. The creature hand closed around her throat and lifted her, and the ice that usually formed when she was under pressure did not come. The void had taken more than it had given back, and her color depth was not recovered enough to produce it. She held the arm with both hands. Her feet were not touching the ground. The sword demon looked at Kay. It said the same word it had used before Red had interrupted. Then it said more, that it had no requirement for the girl, that what it required was the one who could open the witch's barriers, and that if that one came forward, the girl would be set down unharmed. It delivered this without heat. A statement of terms from something that considered the terms straightforward. Kay stepped forward. Not because the options were good, not because he had worked out what happened next. Ellie's grip on the creature arm was slipping, and the drop below her was not short, and the sword demon was not releasing, and stepping forward was the only variable he could change in the next 3 seconds. The slash came from the creature arm, diagonal across his entire torso, full extension, more force than anything in the Blacklands had produced at him. He could not absorb something he had not made contact with before it made contact with him. The strike landed. The force of it lifted him and dropped him, and he hit the ground and did not get back up. Ellie fell. She caught herself. Silence. He came back from the inside out. Awareness returned in pieces. Ground pressure, sky, the ambient sound of the Blacklands resuming. And then something stranger. The feeling of his own left arm reassembling. The ink in his body migrating to the damage site, and rebuilding the structure of it in real time. Visible if he looked down. Deliberate and methodical. Like watching something sculpted from the inside out. It did not hurt in the way damage hurts. It was a different category of sensation entirely. He sat up. The sword demon had released Ellie. It was looking at him with the specific quality of attention that something gives to a thing it has just been forced to reconsider. Not retreat, recalibration. Kay got to his feet and reached out and grabbed the creature arm. The absorption started. The sword demon's ink was not creature grade. It was layered and old and dense in a way that nothing alive in the current Blacklands could match, and it came into him fast and enormous, a pressure system equalizing across the point of contact. The sword demon seized and pulled backward and could not separate from the grip because the grip was not a grip. The pull itself was the connection. The absorption deepened and his hands went darker and his hair went darker, and the demon made a sound it had not produced during its entire exchange with Red. It was strong enough to drag him across the ground. He held on. Something hit the sword demon from the left flank with the force of a structural collapse. Arancia. Orange hair, a hammer that suggested she had thought carefully about what kind of force problem she expected to encounter in her career and had made a proportionate equipment decision. The blow drove the sword demon sideways hard enough to break Kay's contact. The angle changed too fast to hold, and in the gap that created, a line of chroma fire came through the air at a saturation level Kay had not seen Red produce before. It took the sword demon's creature arm at the shoulder joint. Red landed between Kay and where the sword demon was standing. He looked different from before the underground. The vitality that S-rank carried was present but running lower than it had been, the way a fire looks when the fuel is adequate but not without limit. He held the sword demon's attention for 3 seconds without speaking and without moving. The sword demon looked at its missing arm, looked at Kay, looked at Red once more. Then it went backward through the tree line and the Blacklands closed around it. Gale sat down in the soil because his legs decided that was the correct next step. Ellie stood with her hand at her own throat. Arancia lowered the hammer and looked at Kay with an expression that had not finished forming yet. Red turned away from the tree line. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at his own arm, the one he had used to cut, and did not comment on what he saw there. Kay felt the volume of what had accumulated in his chest across the day. Sphere, Creatures, Guardian, partial Sword Demon Drain. Enormous. Unstable at the edges, more than he had ever held at once. The pull opened on its own. He did not choose it. The ambient ink of the black lands oriented toward him the way it always did when the controls slipped. And the difference here from the examination hall was that the black lands had no measured bounds. Everything moved. Soil, root systems, the ink carried in the air. It entered him at a volume his body could not accommodate, and his system ran the only safeguard it had. It stopped taking in and started spending what it held, burning through the absorbed reserve to create distance from the threshold, and the color went out of him the same direction it had come in. His hair went white. His hands went white. The black that had defined him since the tank drained outward until there was nothing left of it and he was albino again, flat and pale, standing in the blacklands on his own 2 feet. He sat down. Red crouched next to him. He looked at Kay's white hair for a moment without comment. Then he said that, for a first unauthorized expedition, they had done acceptable work. He said Kay was on his team regardless of what color his hair was at any given moment. He said this in the flat declarative way he said most things, which meant it was a statement and not a discussion. Kay did not say anything. He was too empty for words. But something in the flatness of what he was feeling had a floor under it that had not been there the morning he had walked out of Mary's workshop, and he noticed the floor, and it was enough. The shop smelled the same. That was the first thing Kay registered when he woke in Mary's workshop. The specific combination of ink solvent and old wood and the flatbread from the stall next door coming through the gap under the door. He was on the low cot Mary kept in the back corner. The light through the window was mid-morning angle. Nero was on the workbench watching him with the settled quality of a creature that had been watching for some time, and had no objection to the duration. He sat up. His body reported nothing. No damage, no residue pain. The color in his hair was white, his hands were pale. He had come back to the city albino, which meant he had come back ordinary, which meant the gates had processed him without incident. Red was standing at the work table with his arms crossed. He said what they had accomplished. He said it plainly. Without construction, the barrier had been opened, the Stella fragment recovered, and no member of the team was dead, which given the specific content of the previous 18 hours was a material outcome. He said the expedition would not appear on any official Corps record. Then he said Kay was on the team, and that the team was his, and that the color of Kay's hair at any particular moment was irrelevant to both of those facts. Kay looked at his white hands for a moment. Then he nodded. The tight thing in his chest that had been there so long he had stopped noticing its weight loosened by a degree, and he was, in the particular exhausted way available to someone who has just survived what he had survived, something close to glad. Gale was near the door and said nothing, which was its own acknowledgement. Ellie sat at the far end of the cot and looked at Kay with the direct attention she gave to most things and did not look away when he noticed. Nero had not digested the Stella fragment. This became clear 3 hours later when Nero opened his mouth over a cloth Mary had laid on the workbench and deposited the fragment there, intact, glowing at precisely the same intensity it had glowed in the underground chamber. Nero looked untroubled by this. Mary stared at the fragment, then at Nero, and her expression had the quality of someone quietly updating several assumptions about biology. Red delivered it to the Luminous that afternoon. The woman they called Celestia, the title was both her name and her rank, the peak authority of Bright City and of every pioneer corps within its walls, received the fragment without visible reaction. But she came to find Kay the following morning. He was sitting behind the workshop on a supply crate when her shadow arrived before she did. She moved quietly for someone who carried that much weight. Her color was every color at once, not chaos, but the complete resolution of something that had worked through all its contradictions and come out the other side. She sat on a crate across from him and told him what he needed to understand. She said he had opened a barrier she could not open. The barriers sealed by the Black Witch Nyx required a specific power signature to access, one that no human colorist, no S-rank, no luminous in 3 centuries had been able to produce. She said she had attempted it herself. She said the signature the barrier needed was his. She asked whether a voice spoke to him in the dark. He told her yes. She was still for a moment. Then she said she was going to work very hard to ensure the wrong people did not discover what he could do, and that until she had managed that, he should be deliberate about who watched him absorb. She stood and gestured for him to follow. 3 blocks away, in the plaza beside the Pioneer Corps building, she placed the fragment in its activation point. It found its connection immediately. A column of light rose from the ground with a sound that was felt before it was heard, a pressure that resolved upward and kept climbing. From the vantage of the nearest elevated street, Kay could see the boundary of the Blacklands pulling back, territory that had been absolute darkness becoming margin, and the margin becoming something that might eventually be livable ground. The city erupted below them. People came out of buildings. Pioneers off duty arrived at the plaza without being summoned. The light was still rising and the crowd was already celebrating in the manner of people who have been told something is impossible long enough to have stopped expecting otherwise, and now cannot contain what they feel watching it happen. The city did not know who had opened the barrier. It was not celebrating Kay. The albino from the lower district who had been thrown in a disposal tank and rejected at the intake counter had no place in this story, as far as the city was concerned. But the thing it celebrated existed entirely because of him. The irony of that had a particular weight that settled over Kay quietly, while Nero sat on his shoulder, and the column of light climbed above the rooftops, and people below them cheered for something they would never correctly attribute. 2 days later, a veteran B-rank pioneer stopped him in the Blacklands, south of the gate checkpoint. 4 of them, positioned at the rock formation that blind spotted the guard rotation. The veteran had a knife out before he finished his explanation of why the chromatic ore Kay had gathered belonged, by some logic, to Pioneer Corps infrastructure rather than to the person who had gathered it. He said the language of someone who knew the legal framing was decoration. Kay handed the ore over. All 4 of them were albino before it hit the ground. He covered the evidence with absorbed black ink at the city gate on the way back. The patrol that passed 90 seconds later found 4 very pale men sitting against a rock and an ore bag beside them, and no straightforward explanation for either. The C-rank reward processing came through the day after. Pioneer bank accounts, official credentials, custom weapon commission slots with the Corps Armory. Gale collected his, in the manner of someone receiving confirmation of something he had always considered a formality. Ellie looked at her ID for a moment longer than the task required. Kay looked at his for a long time. C-rank, Pioneer Corps registered, his name on official material. A small rectangle of what the city said a person was allowed to be, and his name on it, and a date. He put it in his jacket and went to tell Mary. The shop lock was wrong. He knew before he opened the door. The specific position Mary used when she left was not the position it sat in now. Someone had opened it without her key and had not known how she secured it. Inside, the work table overturned, 2 shelves cleared, the cot displaced. A spoit on the floor with its intake mechanism bent. No Mary. He covered the area with inverted vision, the one-eye technique he used for tracking color auras at range. Mary's inner warmth, the gold trace he had been noticing in her for weeks without a name for it, had moved toward the east wall and then gone downward. Below street level, into the underground. He closed the shop behind him and went down. The underground city was not secret. It was the city's operational silence, the layer where the things that made Bright City functional happened without Bright City needing to acknowledge them. Colorless workers in the mines below the registered mines. Supply chains the Corps used but could not formally document. Lawless in the specific way that a place is lawless when those with authority find the lawlessness convenient. The men who met him in the upper transition corridors had been waiting. He had drained them twice before on 2 separate occasions, and they had arrived this time with more people, which said something about optimism. He drained them faster than the previous times and moved deeper. The gang boss made a speech while standing over a man he had apparently executed for an operational failure. Kay crossed the room during the speech and removed the question the boss represented, which brought the speech to an immediate conclusion. The A-rank Shadow Enforcer was different in quality from everything above him in the hierarchy. His crystallization technique produced dense color projectiles, fast, structured, the kind of output that rated A-rank for genuine reason. He filled the corridor with a first volley and watched Kay absorb 3 of them and understood immediately, from the speed, that he was dealing with a different category of problem. He shifted to a second technique, then a third. He was methodical about it, each approach calculated, each adjustment made from observation rather than from panic. By the 6th technique, Kay had absorbed enough to understand the crystallization method well enough to replicate the shape of it. He used it back. The enforcer blocked the first return. The second went through. The absorption that followed was the most complete he had produced against a human opponent. 100%, nothing left. The enforcer sat down slowly in the manner of someone whose body has received a memo that the rest of him has not yet read. Kay stepped over him. Mary was awake at the far end of the room. He knew the room. Not this specific room, a more refined version, more equipment, better built. But the quality of a space that has existed for a long time for a specific purpose leaves a residue that recognition finds before reason does. The smell, the layout of the machinery along the walls, the chairs at the extraction stations with the restraint frames along the armrests. The man who turned from the equipment console when Kay came through the door was older. The particulars of his face had shifted with years. But the way he moved, precise, organized, the manner of a person who has never once understood why other people consider the things he does to be wrong, that had not changed at all. Blanc. Mary said Kay's name, just his name, an anchor thrown across a room. Blanc said it had been a long time, in the voice of someone noting the passage of time between phases of an experiment. He said the facility behind him was a more refined version of the one they had known as children, that the problems of the original design had been resolved through the work of the intervening years. He said this without apology and without cruelty. He said it as information. The memory arrived in Kay without invitation and without sequence. The room that had been presented to them as a dining room, which also functioned as the intake corridor for the extraction sequence. The other children, 8 of them, arrived at different times, who had told Kay and Mary their names and their worries, and the small, specific things they carried from lives before the facility. The boy who pushed bread into the seam of his mattress in case the meals stopped coming. The girl who counted ceiling marks when she needed her mind somewhere else. The chairs had restraints. The children who went in came out pale and quiet in the way that bodies are quiet when they have used up their available capacity for reaction. Blanc noted results in a ledger. He discussed the data with his colleagues in the tone he was using now. Mary had mapped the facility over 6 weeks. Guard rotations memorized, corridor count noted on mornings when the schedule was thinnest. She had told Kay the plan in a voice that was calm the way a person is calm when they have done the work of being calm, because the alternative was not useful. They had reached the exit corridor. The guards had not been where the rotation said they would be. The memory did not come in sequence after that. Sound, shouting in metal corridors, the emergency system activating, a door that was not going to open no matter how much weight was put against it. Mary pulling him back the way they had come. Behind them, the section of the facility containing the extraction lab going in the way that structures go when safety has been secondary long enough. He and Mary had been far enough back. They had walked out into early morning above a ruined section of the underground, and Mary had cried without speaking for a long time, and when she spoke she said they had to carry what those children had trusted them with because that trust was still there, and there was nothing else left to do with it. All of this was in the room with Kay now, alongside Blanc standing in front of his refined equipment, looking at Kay with the particular patience of someone who believes the conversation is going to go the way he has already decided it will go. Mary spoke. She did not ask a question or offer a negotiation. She said what those children had been, and what Blanc had done to them, and what that made him, in a voice that was level throughout, no fluctuation, no concession. The flatness of it was what made it devastating, because it meant she had decided exactly what he was a long time ago and had not needed to arrive at the conclusion in this room. Blanc injected himself from a vial at his belt. The extracted color that hit his system was not his own. It had been taken from people who could not stop him taking it, and the depth of it changed his capability immediately. What followed was not a clean fight. Kay absorbed everything Blanc sent and returned it. Twice. The second return left Blanc against the far wall with the expression of someone whose experiment has produced an unanticipated variable. Mary crossed the room in the gap and took apart the extraction machine's power coupling with a wrench from the tool belt she had kept through the abduction. The facility's backup systems lost their anchor. Blanc triggered the explosives. Kay grabbed Mary, and the corridor behind them became a category of thing corridors are not designed to become, and the floor of the facility gave way, and below it was the reservoir. He had not known there was a reservoir. The ink that had accumulated below the facility over years of extraction overflow had settled into the natural rock cavity and sat there, absorbing more, until it was enormous and dark and as old as the extraction operation itself. It contained everything that had passed through the facility, the extracted colors of everyone Blanc had processed, layered, and compressed. Mary went in before he reached the edge. He went after her. The ink at this depth wanted him the way concentrated color always did, and he let it, absorbing outward in a circle to clear the space near where she was sinking, following her inner warmth. That gold trace he had been noticing for weeks. He reached for it now, the way he reached for everything. He thought about specific things, not abstractions. The morning she had shown him the supply case she had been building for 2 months without telling him. The night in the underground corridor, years ago, when she had said they had to carry what the other children had trusted them with. The first time he had wanted to be a colorist, she had told him he could be one before the thought had fully formed in him. He found her in the dark and took her hand. The gold in her was not a theory anymore. It had been accumulating the same way the reservoir had been accumulating, quietly, without outlet, under pressure, waiting. He reached for it the same way he reached for everything. Mary opened her eyes. They surfaced together. The gold of her hair was visible before her face was, bright and complete. Not a partial emergence but a full one. The color she had carried her entire life without a mechanism to express it, done waiting. She looked at her hands. She looked at Kay. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Nero arrived at the reservoir edge above them. Gale and Ellie came 30 seconds behind Nero. Core security arrived 4 minutes after that and made the arrests the situation provided. Blanc was not among them. He had survived, not intact, but alive, found in the debris by a figure who moved through destruction with the ease of long familiarity. Viper administered something from a case she carried and told him she had not forgotten the arrangement they had made, and that his work would continue, and that the resources now available to him were considerably larger than an underground facility. She said this pleasantly. Mary's Dawn Core evaluation was brief. Camellia had placed a standard test golem at the end of the evaluation floor and told Mary to engage when ready. Mary raised the tool she had been issued, drew from the gold energy she had spent 2 days learning to locate, and fired. The laser was not calibrated. There was no calibration standard for a power that had not existed in any recorded form before that morning. It went through the golem, through the wall behind the golem, through the next wall, and began addressing the one after that, while Mary screamed for instructions, and Camellia dove behind a support column and shouted guidance she was not fully certain would work. When it stopped, the ceiling above the evaluation floor had a new feature. Camellia stood up, brushed ceiling material from her shoulder, and told Mary she was a jewel and that she could start immediately. Red's training was not comfortable. He addressed this directly on the first morning, which removed the ambiguity early. Chroma manifestation, the technique that drew latent color from deep inside the body and saturated it into a weapon or limb, was the threshold requirement for ranks above C, and all 3 rookies arrived at it with different deficits. Gale's issue was precision at the final stage. Ellie's was sustained depth. Kay's problem, Red said, was efficiency. He had been producing output at a level well above his rank through brute force expenditure, which was why he kept going albino at the moments when going albino was the worst available option. Red said he was going to fix the mechanics. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement, not a discussion. 3 weeks into the training, Kay mixed something into a technique during sparring against Red that he had not been able to separate since the reservoir. Mary's gold energy, absorbed in the ink during the awakening and resident in him since, came forward before he could isolate it and combined with the black mid-release. The sparring zone produced a crater. Red stood at the rim looking down. Kay was albino again at the crater's edge, breathing. Red was quiet for a long time. Then he said that was interesting, and told Kay not to repeat it until he understood what it was. Kay looked at the crater and thought that understanding it was going to take a while. The black wave began at dawn. Viper had been building toward it below the city's attention. Creature sent vials, each one calibrated to a specific beast's territorial response, distributed through the underground route network that connected the Blacklands directly to the cavities beneath Bright City. The 19-tailed beast moved first when she activated the system, and everything behind it oriented to the direction it chose. The Pioneer Corps mobilized. Red's team deployed with the third wave, moving into a field that was already producing the sounds of a battle that had not waited for them. Kay heard the sword demon before he located it. The layered wrong resonance of that voice, cutting through the field noise from 40 meters ahead. It did not say Key this time, it said his name. The name the demon had not known at the expedition but had learned in the weeks since, and said now in an active battlefield in front of every pioneer force and creature horde present. Whoever needed to know it would know it before this morning was over. Kay's hand went black. Mary was not visible from his position. She was 300 meters back on the city wall's secondary tier, inside a reinforced cannon unit, operating targeting systems she had learned in the 2 weeks since Camellia handed her the documentation and told her to be ready before the invasion came. She was not where Kay could see her. He did not know she was here at all. The horde advanced. The sword demon moved through it toward Kay with the directness of something that has spent weeks deciding exactly what it intends to do and has now arrived at the moment to do it. Red landed to Kay's left. Gale took his right. Ellie moved to cover the angle. Kay stepped forward.